going to be honest with you guys. I came to a point where I'm tired of watching the same script just play over and over again. So this is going to be another one of those videos for you guys that's going to be maybe a little bit difficult and maybe kind of pull back the veil of what is happening in our industry today. So every few years, the government rolls out a new program to help farmers.
It was a program created to rescue farmers from the depression.
Is a 70-year-old system of farm subsidies.
Primarily, those row crop farmers are struggling a lot. They're also dealing with high input costs, from fertilizers to seeds are just across the board more expensive.
When you put out hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of inputs each year, hoping for an opportunity to harvest it and market it for hopeful profit.
To most, it sounds great. Money going back into agriculture, more support for pollinators, maybe even a lifeline for struggling beekeepers. But have you ever noticed that money never seems to quite end up where it's supposed to? Instead, it somehow finds its way into the same few pockets. Big chemical companies, ag tech firms, and massive distributors that already dominate the industry. So today, I want to talk about one of those programs. We've already covered ELAP and what it does for beekeepers, but there's a new one on the horizon called the UPLIFT Initiative. And on paper, it sounds great. More support, more funding, and maybe even a little bit of hope for the industry. But before we get too excited, we've seen this story before. Starting with diving into how farm subsidies actually work. So farm subsidies actually started with really good intentions. The idea was simple: help farmers survive bad seasons, keep food prices stable, and make sure that rural communities could actually stay alive. Back during the Great Depression, that made total sense. Farmers were going under left and right, and then you had the dust storms that were wiping out crops, and America needed food security bad. So the government stepped in with financial support. And I mean, it worked at first, but here is where things started to shift. Over time, those programs stopped looking like farmer support and started looking more like corporate support. If you truly think about it, when a subsidy check goes out, that money doesn't just sit in the farmer's pocket. Most of it actually gets spent on all of the inputs that they have. So you have the seed, the fertilizer, the fuel, the chemicals, machinery, all of that stuff farmers have to buy just to keep producing. And guess who sells those things? The same handful of giant companies: Bayer, Corteva, Syngenta, John Deere, you name it. So the money technically starts with the government, but it passes through the farmer and ends up right back in those corporate accounts. In fact, in 2022, there was about $6 billion in crop support that went to both corn and soy. Those crops are almost entirely tied to fertilizer and seed inputs. And here's the kicker: the voices lobbying in Washington for more subsidies, they're not the small farmers, even though you would think so. They're actually the chemical and the seed corporations themselves. They push for programs that keep the money flowing toward their products, not necessarily towards independent farmers. So when you truly step back and take a look at it, it's kind of like a revolving door of taxpayer dollars. The farmer is just the middleman in a much bigger system. And the crazy part is that money doesn't go to small family farms anymore. There's actually a couple studies that show that something like 80% of all subsidies go to less than 10% of farms. And those are usually the biggest operations, the ones that are already working closely with those corporations. So when you zoom out, because, that's what I like to do, look at the big picture, you actually start to see a pattern. The government gives out support. The farmers then spend it on approved or industry standard inputs, and those inputs are made by the same 4 or 5 companies that dominate global agriculture. You can actually start to see that this creates a sort of feedback loop that keeps the farmers dependent instead of independent. But it's not that the subsidies don't help. They do. They actually do help. But they also quietly reinforce a system where power and profit keep funneling upward. Now, the reason why this matters for beekeepers is because this same pattern can carry over into pollinator programs like UPLIFT. We could see the exact same thing happen. A program that is supposed to help us might actually end up helping the corporations who make the products for us instead. So before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's actually look into why this matters for beekeepers, because the truth is the beekeeping industry is actually in a really tricky spot right now. Honey prices are at or below the cost of production due to foreign imports of funny honey. Labor and transport costs have more than doubled in the last decade, and bee health issues keep piling up. For many commercial beekeepers, it is seriously a choice between doing what's best for their hives long term or gambling on short-term cash flow. And why exactly does this matter? Because the commercial side of the industry is aging fast. The average migratory commercial beekeeper is actually in their 60s right now. Many are going broke or selling out. And actually, in one recent buyout offer from a company called GeoCure, I know many of you have heard of them, it highlighted that actually just 138 operators control 1.3 million of our 2 million migratory hives. That is actually very alarming in the concentration. And if those people were to exit the industry, there's no one to replace them. Thus, why ELAP has been absolutely essential for beekeepers. In today's world, with the new chemical challenges, habitat loss, and unpredictable environmental pressures, it's often the lifeline that keeps operations afloat when disaster strikes or when pollinating crops that aren't necessarily the best for the long-term health of our hives. It's designed for emergencies. And to be quite honest with you, right now, you could argue that the entire industry is living in a state of emergency. Now, imagine, use your imagination, that the same system that I had just mentioned, where most of the money that's given in subsidies ends up with the corporations, moves into something like the beekeeping industry. So far, the beekeeping industry, I would say, is one of the last sectors of ag that hasn't been completely corporatized. Independent, small-scale beekeepers are still able to build successful operations for themselves and for their family. But this is where the new program UPLIFT actually comes in. It promises funding specifically for beekeepers. So if you missed it, I went into the fine details of this program in a previous video. So I'll throw that up here in the corner if you haven't seen that yet. So when you think of UPLIFT, think of it kind of like the ECAP program for row crops. But instead of being reactive, it is proactive. It's meant to give beekeepers a real positive incentive to actually keep their hives healthy and thriving. The goal is to reward successful beekeepers, giving them breathing room to make smart decisions instead of reacting in a crisis. But here's the thing. Money alone does not guarantee that it actually helps the people on the ground. If it isn't carefully directed, that funding could just flow past the beekeepers and into the hands of whoever's selling the solutions. And right now, those solutions are often biotech companies developing gene editing treatments, RNA-based Varroa mite control, synthetic bee feeds, or even proprietary bee genetics. Every single product comes with the promise of saving the bees and a price tag. And we're starting to see this happen. Some of the treatments that we've been coming out with are absolutely amazing innovations. They could really help us manage Varroa mites more effectively. But the problem is that if government funding starts reimbursing or incentivizing those products, small-scale beekeepers could end up dependent on them just to survive. And that is the last thing that we want. Suddenly, independence is gone and survival depends on corporate technology. You know, it's kind of a tricky situation because on one hand, we want the innovation. We need better tools, better treatment, smarter hives. But on the other hand, if the subsidies aren't structured carefully, the system just replaces one type of stress with another, dependency on corporate solutions instead of giving beekeepers real power and choice. This is exactly why it is so important to pay attention to who is really benefiting from these programs like UPLIFT. And the lesson, if you pay attention to history and what's gotten us to where we are today, traditional agriculture is clear. If the money mainly ends up in the corporate hands, the people doing the work, the beekeepers, they don't actually see the gains. So the question that we honestly really need to ask ourselves is, how do we make sure that the funding reaches the beekeepers and not just the companies that produce the tech? Now, let's zoom in to what is happening in biotech right now. Companies are developing gene editing treatments and RNA interference solutions for Varroa mites, the same ones that we've talked about before from Greenlight Biosciences. These technologies are actually pretty impressive. They could really help us fight Varroa more effectively than anything that we have ever had before. But there's a catch. There always is. Innovation almost always comes with ownership. When a company patents a treatment or a proprietary bee line, they're not just selling a product, they're effectively controlling the conditions for survival. They set the price, the availability, and often the rules for how it can be used. And this is where subsidies intersect with the story. If funding starts flowing towards these products instead of directly supporting beekeepers, it can create a system where small-scale and even medium-sized beekeepers become dependent on biotech giants. Does that sound kind of familiar? Like something maybe we've seen before? That is exactly what has happened in row crop agriculture. With seeds and chemicals, farmers got stuck buying inputs every single season just to stay in business. And that is the danger to us. Imagine a future where instead of managing your hives with tools and practices that you can control, you're forced to rely on expensive, patented treatments just to keep your colonies alive and moving forward. Independence and resilience, the very things that allowed beekeeping to survive for centuries, will start to erode. Now, on the flip side, these innovations can be game changers, but only if the incentives and funding are structured in a way that can actually empower the beekeeper, not just the company that's selling the solution. That's why programs like UPLIFT matter so much. They have the potential to put resources directly into the beekeepers' pockets, giving them breathing room to adopt innovation on their own terms rather than being forced into dependency. So, yes, the gene editing boom is exciting, but we have to pay attention to who holds the power. The company controlling the patent or the beekeeper who's controlling the hive. But there is a flip side, thankfully. It's not all doom and gloom. The funding does have potential. If even a portion of those UPLIFT dollars went directly into the hands of real beekeepers, we could rebuild the industry from the ground up. Imagine what that could look like. Funding local bee research instead of corporate R&D labs, supporting independent equipment manufacturers. investing in bee breeding programs to further our progress towards Varroa resistance, or helping small honey processors and co-ops compete. And finally, maybe we could actually start tackling foreign honey and furthering anti-dumping regulations. That is how you build a resilient beekeeping economy, not by outsourcing innovation and funding, but by empowering the people who live in it every single day. Because to be completely honest with you, this is what I do constantly with everything that I do. I zoom in, I zoom out, I look at the big picture of all the moving parts and what is going on. And when you do that, you start to see how much is changing, and pretty fast. So we have fake honey being mass produced in labs overseas. You have AI powered hive boxes that promise to manage bees without you ever picking up a frame. And companies like GeoCure testing just how willing this industry is to trade independence for convenience. I'm going to pause right there and make sure you heard that. And that is what makes this moment so incredibly important. The direction that we take over the next 5 to 10 years will define whether beekeeping remains a craft, a livelihood, a culture, or if it becomes just another corporate and controlled input in the ag supply chain. So the reason I make this video is because we have to be very careful, because all of this, the funding, the biotech, the consolidation, the foreign honey, the automation, it is all connected. There is a bigger agenda that is unfolding, and whether the future works for beekeepers or goes completely around them depends entirely on the choices that we make right now. Remember, history shows it best. Added pressure almost always, actually, I should just say always, results in people making short-term decisions or complying to things that don't necessarily have the best interest of our future in mind. So the opportunity is there, but only if we actually stay awake to where the money is flowing, who's shaping the narrative, and who actually stands to benefit. The power to steer the future of beekeeping still does exist. It's happening right now, but it has to come from the ground up. If programs like UPLIFT truly aim to support beekeepers, then let's make sure that they actually do, because the future of beekeeping and pollination itself depends on who gets lifted. So at the end of the day, this isn't just about subsidies or programs. This is about the future of an entire industry that keeps our food on the table. Beekeepers aren't just managing hives, they're protecting ecosystems, pollinating crops, and preserving a way of life that has existed for generations. So programs like UPLIFT could actually really make a difference, but only if we stay aware of the bigger picture. We have to make sure that the support reaches the people on the front lines, the beekeepers, not the corporations selling the solutions. You know, this is really a pivotal moment where the decisions that we make over the next few years, how we structure support, how we adopt technology, how we defend independence, will shape whether beekeeping remains a thriving, sustainable craft or becomes just another cog in the corporate machine. So, as viewers, as beekeepers, as advocates for pollinators and food security, we have a role to play. We need to stay informed, support independent operations, and question where the funding and innovation are really going. Because, to be honest with you, when beekeepers are empowered, bees thrive, crops thrive, and our food system, it thrives too. Just like I talked about in another video, I'll throw that up here if you haven't seen that. And that is the future that we should all be working towards. So let's keep this conversation going. Comment below with your experiences or ideas about supporting beekeeping and keeping this industry independent. Let's make sure that our voices are heard as decisions about the future are made. And don't forget to share this with a friend that can help deepen this conversation further. And hopefully help more people understand what's really at stake for the future of our bees. So I hope this video was helpful. I'll see you guys in the next one. Oh, and don't forget, don't quit and be fit.